Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today. Today is May 9th, 2023. This is a City of Prescott study session. Roll call, please.
Mayor Good,
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Montoya,
Here.
Councilwoman Kentelmi,
Here.
Councilman Moore,
Here.
Councilmember Rusing,
Here.
Councilman Sishka,
Here.
and Councilman Tenney.
Yes.
All are present.
Very good. We have one item for discussion today. I guess I'll read it. Presentation and discussion regarding the quarterly update of the Mayor's Commission for Water Policy Review and Monitoring.
Share the floor. Okay. Good afternoon. I don't think I've seen a fully seated council yet in this in these chambers, so it's kind of surprising. Yeah.
Exciting, isn't it?
I'm used to a different venue. So let's get started. Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council, and welcome City Manager Gregory. I'm Leslie Grazer, Public Works Water Resource Project Manager and Staff Liaison, along with Mary Kay Wissanen for the Mayor's Commission on Water Policy Review and Monitoring. I would also like to recognize my supervisor, Brian Reese. He's also Public Works, of course, Water Resources and Environmental Services Manager, who may join the discussion today. And last, I was looking in the audience to see if I had any of the commissioners here today. We've moved the meeting around a little bit, so sometimes we have one, maybe two. And one called me and said I had some other things going on. Obviously, these are all businessmen and women primarily, and so they have other things going on. But I'll do my best to represent them today with the topic at hand. So there is a lot of material in your packet today, and so I'm going to try to bounce along pretty quickly, but please stop me if you have any questions. As the staff liaison for this Mayor's Commission, I would like to provide, of course, a quarterly update, but more so I'd like to seek your thoughts, inputs that will help the Commission. In particular, 3 or so of the draft recommendations or policy areas that are in your packet that you would like the Commission to finalize and bring back through the Council Subcommittee for Water Issues, Council Study Session, and then Council voting. So this is the direction we were given from our legal department of how to proceed with changes. So for example, Policy 3 speaks to the use of the Water Resource Management Model. Policies 11 through 14 relate to the water budget. Those might be high on your list as you've read through the packet. And then Policy 20 and 21 relate to the portfolio and actions that the city may not be able to take due to other documents or actions. And so it's more of a cleaning of the text exercise. Some of these are bigger challenges, and I'll explain those, why those are shortly. And second, your thoughts on bridging the city's water planning with the 2022 policy until the decision and order of assured water supply is conferred by ADWR, while also investing staff time in building a framework for a long-term management plan from which codes and policies can be developed to achieve long-term goals. So in your packet today, you did see a presentation. You can see the date on it. So I think that's called upcycling a PowerPoint from a previous use because it contained most of the information that was needed. It was at the Commission's last monthly meeting on April 18th. And it contains the 2 focus areas for today. One is a synopsis of recommendations and draft policy recommendations that the Commission voted upon. The results of their voting are shown in your packet itself. We didn't put it as part of the presentation, but you can kind of see how they deliberated. If there aren't any questions at this point, I'll go ahead and start moving through the PowerPoint. And I'm going to jump ahead.
Please proceed.
To slide 3. Let's see if I have that correct. Okay. So nobody wants a slide read to them, and I'm only going to cherry pick some of the pieces on this one, and I hope you can see it. So looking under the draft synopsis of recommendations, the first paragraph reads, the city's water resource management practices underwent significant changes during the approximate 2018 to 2021 timeframe, and it appears many processes and tracking practices were eliminated by the 2019 policy. With the 2019 policy, there were also code changes that went into effect. During this time, significant supplies were placed into development agreements, contracts, or within contract amendments. The amounts being issued or modified appear to be about 1,821 acre feet. Skipping ahead to the next paragraph, for the 2022 water policy, the city returned to a 2018 policy that was used as a base document. Upon review, it looks or appears that the work of the staff tasked with the revision, the policy development team, which just a group of people that were assigned to it, produce a document that has disconnects where two or more thought processes on water management were attempted to be fused. And so you can see that can create some challenges. And I put in parentheses, let's see, we don't have a pointer. That's not going to work. Okay. Well, there's some parentheses in the top paragraph that kind of speak to those, and they can be small disconnects, or sometimes they can be a larger disconnect that we would like to try to remedy. So before we look at individual examples related to those parentheses that show that in reviewing the individual policies 1 through 22, I would like to present the Commission's overarching thoughts and draft recommendations that were voted 6-0 with one absent excuse present at that voting session. Okay. So the first one, unfortunately, I will read the entirety of this. It is recommended the city continue with its 2022 policy as it it's more effective than the 2019 policy for managing finite water supplies. However, it should remove or correct any language that the city doesn't or can't actually act upon. Some policies that don't have clear procedures for staff and the applicant may need to be removed until such time procedures are in place and can be enforced. So why we think this, why it appears that the 2019 policy fell short and we're recommending that the 22 is more effective. In some cases, in some cases, it didn't recognize some practices the city had in relation to various Arizona Revised Statute, Title 45, so those are ADWR directives. It moved away from long-time city water resource management practices. It provided limited guidance, to staff who were responsible to work with these, with those seeking water from the city. It was, I'm not sure now, I'm losing my voice. And no water. Imagine that, the water lady. I tried to tank up out there. Thank you, ma'am. Got a long ways to go yet. Okay. See if that helps. Okay. Also, development agreements were being prepared at the same time. This is awful. I do apologize. Development agreements were being prepared at the same time the 2019 water policy was being modified, and I think this was causing some confusion. So on the first page, or the first changes that the group recommended, the policy is effective in comparison to the 2019 policy. Yes. So let me move to.
Councilmember Rusing, did you have a question?
I would just like to clarify that we're reviewing some history, and we're actually talking about 3 different water policies. We have the original water policy, the 2019 policy, which was passed during the Mayor Mangarelli's term, and then we have the 2022 water policy, which was passed during Mayor Phil Good's term. So I just wanted to clarify that for the public.
Yes, ma'am, you're correct. And part of our tasking was, is the 2022 policy effective? And you can look at it in itself, or you can start doing some comparisons. And so the commission did some comparison for that. So I do recognize that we do have a commissioner in the audience, and so you might be able to direct some questions to that commissioner. And I'll see if there's any more that might be hiding around the corner. Okay, so let's see.
Welcome, Commissioner Taylor.
Yep. Thank you. So we will follow the next bit of this slide. It is recommended the city begin the process to develop a long-term water management plan, incorporating the water resource management model and appropriate legal documents, with the commission identifying disconnects in the 22 policy, i.e. recommendations for or concerns related to 16 of the 22 policies within the document text. And so not just the policies, but there's also text within the document. And they provide some comments. It is evident the city is lacking a long-range water management plan to carry the city's water health and safety when there are changes from one elected to and leadership bodies to another. The 2022 policy may bridge the city while a long-term plan is developed and aligns with its pending decision in order of assured water supplies, which is currently under review at ADWR. Alignment with the city's 2025 general plan will also be important. Note that the city's service area extends outside the general plan area. So I promised I wouldn't read the whole entire slide, but some of them I just have to read. I apologize. These are, this is one of the statements that was voted 6-0 by your commission to bring forward to you about their work and what they're seeing. And then the last overarching synopsis point that the commission brought forward is it is recommended, and I believe this is on the next slide, it is recommended the city develop procedures for the use of the water resource management model, also known as the WRM, that are not currently drafted nor reflected in the policy. So, because there was so much in this packet, I had to script this a little bit, so I apologize that I'm standing here reading my notes, but I'm trying to move you as quickly as possible.
Excuse me.
So I'll pause.
Mayor?
Yes, ma'am.
Mayor? May I speak?
Well, I know you didn't take your last comment down, so I felt it was still the same comment. So,
Sorry.
Yes, Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. Could you expound on this, the paragraph where it addresses briefly the WRM, Water Resource Management Model? It says, appears the 2022 water policy is allocating supplies beyond the WRM as filed with the city's pending DAWS. Could you clarify that a little bit?
I'd be happy to, ma'am. I'll hear a little bit, and then also a little bit further in the presentation, the commission brought forward a little bit more on it as well. So probably what you recall, I'm assuming, is that we had a water issues subcommittee meeting recently, and we looked at the WRM again, and we looked at it, not as a learning process, but comparing it to the policy. So what we're seeing is there are gaps between what the policy is saying the WRM will do and how it's actually being used. And so an example, if you're looking for one, is if a piece of property says it's going to be, 20 multifamily, but the applicant comes in with 100 multifamily, then the WRM doesn't know that. And unless staff is checking and we have a little more conversation, it doesn't mean the project can't happen. It just means that we need to make sure if we're relying on a database tool is basically what the WRM is, then we need to make sure it's keeping in step, or if there's a question, we address it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. And this was good timing because I was going to pause there. So what you had in those 3 bullet points was basically the overarching discussions and bringing them up to as succinct as possible, the concerns. And so from those 3 bullet points, the commission could benefit by your additional thoughts on that. Let's see. We're going to start moving into some specific recommendations. As I said, I don't think there's actually time to go through each and every one today. But please note that these are draft. They're works in progress, so it's understood that they need to be more succinct, and move them through a process that we discussed earlier, going to the subcommittee, going to study, and then going to a voting session where you can actually have a vote on a very succinct plan for what changes may or may not be made. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward in this PowerPoint. to slide 9, except for it's hard to read the corner. I think I got it. Okay. So the commission voted 6-0, one absent excused, to bring this draft recommendation to the council study session as an example of one of the 16 policies elevated as a concern. And I'll just, once again, I'm not reading the entire slide. I'm just going to grab you the first sentence. So policy 3 is determining the water usage. Policy 3 basically says, speaks to determining water usage based on the WORM unless a demand analysis is requested by the city. So this goes back to Councilmember Rusing's question. So we're hitting it again a little bit more. So their first recommendation was protect the allocation and in turn the city's water future ability to handle unforeseen circumstances by setting a water allocation figure for residential based on the WORM's citywide residential use numbers with a 0.5 increase. So a lot more text after that. Skipping down to the next one, number 2, council seek a recommendation from community development to determine the area of code. This is within landscape development code. What needs to be updated? Boy, that doesn't sound right. Wait a minute, let me back up. It should be the land development code. I'm going to pause here again. We were working through these fairly quickly, drafting their ideas. We moved them directly into a voting session, and I didn't clean up all the language because some of them, I tried to be respectful of those who actually sent me certain things. So I think we're talking more about land development code, and within the land development code, there's landscape requirements. So I'll continue.
Mayor Pro Tem, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Leslie,
Yes, sir.
looking at this, this increase, so if I'm reading this and understanding it correctly, the recommendation here is that we increase it from 0.17 to 0.26. Is that essentially the recommendation?
Yes, sir.
Right, and is that merely based on the need for allocation of landscaping, or is it a broader concern?
No, you're making a good point here, and this is where the commission is having challenges. You can read one of the policies, and they can branch off into so many different needs. So these are, I would say, these are distinct points. So a distinct point is the commission said, I think we need to address the allocation for residential. And I think maybe we want to put some kind of additive on it to kind of give us a cushion until we get through our decision
Which is
order.
a recommendation I've heard you make as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is, in a broader sense, what are the implications that that doesn't align with our current pending decision order?
So the concern there is that we're running right at the billing number, not offering ourselves any leeway.
Cushion, yeah, sure.
Right. So within the decision order, it's also been reflected at a 0.17. I think that I'm trying to think of how to explain this, as these are always rabbit holes a little bit, but the city's former decision order was at 0.35. And by the city moving through their policy practices to go to a 0.17, which is a good working number internally, you do want a cushion on it. It's also the effect of going to 0.17 basically tried to double the portfolio. So from a staff's standpoint, I'm concerned about if we don't have our document back out from the department, we might want to be a little more careful about how we allocate in the event we don't get the amount of water we would hope for.
So am I hearing you correctly? And you're speaking very carefully, and I appreciate that.
I'm trying. I don't know if we're getting lost in the discussion.
No. And I'll just quickly kind of succinctly say what I think I hear you saying is that the recommendation here, kind of broadly, is that we go beyond that 0.17. Is that correct?
Provide ourselves a little bit of
More
breathing
cushion.
room. Yeah, until we get all the documents realigned and understand our futures a little bit better.
And what was the vote on this one?
This one was 6-0, I believe.
So it was unanimous recommendation from the commission that we give ourselves some more cushion in this allocation.
Correct.
Okay, Thank you,
But I'm going to
Leslie.
put a however.
Sure, go ahead. However.
These are draft, and
Yeah.
so we know that we're going to have to tighten a little bit more through these and explain a little more, the background of why would you do that? Because
Right.
I think it's important for the public. It's important, of course, for the elected to make
Right.
sure they understand the reasoning behind it versus just these quick.
Makes
Notes.
tons of sense to me. I just want to make sure I understood kind of the broad picture of it.
Cross-check.
And I think I do, and hopefully everyone else up here does too.
Mayor?
Okay.
Oh, Mayor, I'm sorry. May I ask a question? I don't see it. I don't have that voting on there.
Yeah, you're not logged in.
I am. Okay, I'll work on
City
that. But
clerk.
let me just ask a question real
Not
quick
working.
to
Yeah, go ahead. You can ask your question.
Leslie. Okay. Leslie, can I ask you something about the worm? We talk a lot about the worm, the water resource management model. How often is that worm updated with real-time water allocation for like kind, like for example, a multifamily unit? We did that just recently, and you and Gwen spoke about that for an upcoming development that was presented to us. And is it updated frequently for like-kind properties and introduced in the model? Or how long has it been since the worm is updated with more accurate data?
Yes, ma'am. So the worm is updated currently once a year. So we wait for the billing data. So let's use a real year, 2022 billing data starts filtering in January of 23. For this year, we're trying to do the information transfer from a consultant to staff in-house, our GIS staff. So it's a little longer in our update. So we're about 98% complete with that. But to your question, right now, once a year. So you can see if there's something that happens in January of 23, we're not going to see it back updated in the worm until 2024. Although these things can be adjusted. It's about how your procedures.
Would it be prudent to draft a policy based on that cushion we're talking about? Because obviously it's got to be on a project-by-project basis. So if you're considering a 10% cushion, if you will, on the allocated amount, I'm assuming we're doing that because every project is not exactly the same. And so are we then allowing ourselves a little bit of leeway, as you're talking about, by doing that? And obviously there's nothing wrong with overestimating rather than underestimating. That water still goes back.
Correct. I think there's reasons why you would do it. We didn't list every reason why, but I think you make a point that could be another reason why the city puts a little cushion on it.
Do we have a percentage that you've decided?
We did a half an acre foot.
So would it be prudent to craft the policy and codify that?
We could send that back to the commission as one of the items that was brought up today, and then bring it back to you in a format that you can actually vote on.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Shishka.
Thanks, Mayor. Appreciate that. You know, Leslie, actually, the pre-2018 policy had it at 0.35 per single-family residence, so we're getting better. But my concern is that while it sounds prudent to have the buffer, that means that theoretically we will run out of our allocation from the state sooner. And my concern is that since we are the most efficient water user in the area, that we're going to somehow shove projects out into the county or out into a surrounding municipality who may not treat water as we treat water. So, you know, I guess my question is, are we kind of cutting off our nose to spite our face by having a buffer at all?
Well, I think there's implications to everything you do, and that's part of what your commission has to look at is if we do this, what are the possible outcomes and, the pros and cons. So I think you make valid points, things that the city has considered in the past. I've been with the city since 2010, basically. the beginning of that year, and they were struggling with the same things you are grappling with now because every generation talks water. So point well taken, and we'll see if we can find that balance that you're speaking of, not going too far one direction or the other. I mean, the pendulum always swings, but we have to try to, for long-term health and safety of the community, we need to have a little more bounds to work with.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I would say that our responsibility is to manage our portfolio of water within the city for the best interest of the residents of this city, and trying to say that we should manage it in a different way because the county or other municipalities around the city decide to use their access to some water resource in a different manner is not what we should be doing. So I agree. I think we need to manage our own water portfolio as effectively as possible, be potentially a leader in the area so that our surrounding neighbors might say, gee, they're doing such a great job in Prescott and they're using these policies. Maybe we could adapt those to ourselves because we are pulling from a common aquifer. Now, in the past, we had determined that single-family homes would use 0.25, and then we would add a 10%, 0.10 acre-foot for a projected amount of utilization for non-residential activities. So whether they're visiting a splash pad or going to a restaurant, then there was a determination without a whole lot of data to say, let's just add a 0.10 to the top of that to see what the total impact would be for a single-family home. So once the worm was developed and we could start actually looking at how much water was being used by new homes, that's where that 0.17 came in, and then the non-residential use was tracked separately. But you're right. If in the past we'd have one home using 0.17 and a second home using 0.17, we would be at 0.34. And that would mean that two homes could be built, where in the past only one was allowed because it was 0.35. So in this case, using the worm to actually measure legitimate actual use, I think is a very valuable tool. But in the past, or when it was first developed, we weren't going to be able to do a look back for 5 years. So if we determined that a new home being built was going to use 0.17, and they decided they were going to put in a massive orchard in their backyard, and all of a sudden their 0.17 became 0.35, we wouldn't know about it or act on it potentially for 5 years. And I think that worm can be much more of a monitoring and a potential enforcement tool to make sure that the water that is allocated is actually used according to the way it's expected to be used. And if it turns out that it's not being used that way, or somebody has a very leaky outdoor drip system, we can look at it and say, gee, something is happening here. We need to step in and maybe consult or advise this homeowner that they're using much more water than they were allocated and expected to use. So I hope that's what the commission is kind of working on, to see if we can refine this policy to make it as effective as possible. Council Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to reiterate a point, I guess, is this commission is made up of a variety of folks from across the community, right? I mean, you've got someone who's representative of the commissioner here is an architect in his field. There's a construction person. There's people from water advocacy groups, former council members who've been steeped in water. And their unanimous recommendation was that we create a buffer. It just felt like that was worth reiterating.
Makes sense.
But we still need to formalize it and make it very succinct for a vote for you. So is it okay?
Please
do you want me to
proceed.
move on? Okay. So just to So just on policy 3, and this is, I think, where some of the confusion started when I was going through this, is that one policy, even though it says, determining water usage is based on the worm, there were other things that were feeding into, there were other things, I do the same thing sometimes, it's okay. Other things feeding in from their thought processes that they wanted to address, and this is where number 2 came in about the council seeking a recommendation and trying to figure out what more than ADWR low water use plant list should be redlined in the code. And so here again, there's implications to everything. If you drop yourself down to, no vegetation, that doesn't create a very fun environment. So we know that there's others that are like, whoa, wait a minute, so we can crank down on something so hard that we go, oh, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't the best decision. So should we be using water efficiently outdoors? Yes. Should we be finding the nice places where community can gather, park places? Yes. We got to figure out how to do all those things. So I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time. Have somebody watchdogging me in the audience, so I told they would pull me off when it was time to go. They also noted as a recommendation for policy number 3, correct the 22 policy to state how the worm averages are determined and when they should be presented to the elected in council or subcommittee. So that was just I think a text fix. Basically, it says a 5-year rolling average, and that's not exactly how the worm works. So we want to make sure that we're using the correct terms. Pretty basic. The last one, oh no, there's 2 more. The council should verify if the worm is being used when new applications come in for either residential or non-residential that may seek densities higher than what the worm shows. And we've already had that discussion that was brought up by a council member. So we're good there. And the last is to conduct a landscape water use analysis. So we do have one member that is very focused, although I think they're all interested in it, to really dig into the numbers. But I've been concerned as a staff liaison that if we dig too far into one data set, we don't get the job done that you asked us to do. So we can do that. It's a matter of when to time that in. So next, the commission has been working to provide recommendation on water budget text and related policies. The water budget policies are number 11 through 14. Let me jump a few slides. Okay. These are shown in your council member, and only policy 13 and 14 were elevated to even discussing more at the commission level. But when they did their vote the other day, they tabled 13, did a no action, and I think that might have been due. I'll have to kind of check my memory here, but we might have had a to be determined on that. So the commission wasn't exactly sure how to present their concern to you. So we left it as a to be determined, which resulted in it being tabled, a no action. So there's still work to do there. And then policy 14, draft recommendation was passed 6-0 with 1 absent excused. So policy 14 is talking about no single water use application will be approved for water use estimates greater than 50% of the remaining. Goes on from there. And then there was additional language that was added in late 22 that said if city council grants an appeal, the amount of water granted in the appeal would not reduce the remaining budget for that 6-month period by a commensurate amount. So I'm trying to keep that in the policy. We don't want that lost kind of in the minutes. It wasn't formally put into the policy through a resolution, so we kind of have to watch that decision has been made. So then the committee has come back and said, the council, this is commission recommendation number 1, the council seek to roll any unused volumes of the following 6-month period. So I've heard the word used as fungible. We've seen the city practices like that in the past, where if it wasn't used in one time frame, it rolled to the next. I gave you I don't want to use the word cushion anymore, but it gave you the opportunity for maybe bigger projects that might be on the horizon that you would want, but it just takes time for things to accrue. So, however, the commission would caution the transferring of commercial or the non-residential water budget to the residential budget until there is clear information from community development and possibly other departments that the residential already approved has the complementary support services. So the upsizing of existing commercial, added commercial, job creation, fire, police, et cetera. So I think you've heard this one time and time again is, are we making sure those support services, there's police in the right areas now in the city, there's fire departments in the right areas of the city, is there grocery stores, and we haven't spent, or the city hasn't spent its portfolio all on residential housing. And then the second one is the appeal process needs to be more specific, have some distinct non-negotiable requirements, as well as deducting the volume granted from the remaining volume the city has to allocate. So I've heard that concern both in commission and other places, that this last bit that's highlighted on the slide.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Leslie, with
Yes, sir.
regards to more specific, distinct, non-negotiable requirements, does staff or the commission have any recommendations of what those should look like?
I'll have to check my notes. I don't have any off the top of my head I can offer you.
Just a little bit of guidance on that might be helpful.
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
I'll circle that, just in case I don't catch it in the review of the minutes. Okay. Okay, and if there aren't any questions, last we moved to policy 20 and 21 and the draft recommendations. And please recall, these aren't all of them. We weren't going to go through them one by one. Oh. Should I stop?
Mr. Mayor, I have a question.
Councilmember Rusing.
Before we go to 20 and 21, I have a question about policy number 19. I see that it failed 3-3, and Commissioner Gary Beverly was absent, and apparently he would have voted for it and passed it. So I was just wondering what needs to be addressed, and why was this somewhat contentious, I guess?
Let me see if I can backtrack. I'm sorry, I can't keep all their recommendations
Yeah.
straight in my head and what, and I didn't bring my full
Yeah.
working notebook
Yeah.
either. Let me see what else is in the policy itself.
Yeah, Krupnik,
I think there was
Worob,
something within
and
it.
Gary Beverly.
Yeah, just a moment.
Commissioner
So,
Taylor, do you want to
the
address
full-
that concern?
If you have some input, I'm happy to share.
Hi, Mayor, members of the council. First off, I think staff has been doing a great job of herding this group of
I don't
cows
know if
together.
the
and
mic's
doing-
on. I don't know if your mic's on.
It is. You just have to get real close.
Am I just not talking
There
closely?
you go, okay.
On this particular item, my recollection is that there was some feeling that these things are already established in other areas of the development land development code or the building codes for the city, and that this was somewhat redundant. So that was the only thing I could offer.
I think that's a
And
very
obviously-
good explanation. Thank you for being another
So
brain.
I can't
that
speak
can
for the
take-
whole commission, but just for myself.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
And I'll go back and get you an answer, because I know we have it in my binder worth of work this group has done. I should just bring more things with me. Okay. Let's move to the last two. Okay, so policy 20. I need to flip through my notes too. Once again, a draft recommendation, so it's speaking to savings accrued to the effective date hereof, accumulated from the difference between the overall volumes of water allocated and the actual volumes consumed by projects that were put into contract shall be retained in the WORM as committed demand and not used to support additional development. And so the council recommendation, or the commission recommendation, was council seek from the policy development team what was prepared to execute this policy. If there is no procedure in place or prepared to manage this policy, then it needs to be addressed. So I think the challenge here is that if you make a statement like this, however, you filed documentation with the state as part of your decision and order that you're going to use some of that water for future development, then your different documents need to align. And you don't want to be caught up in a no man's land on this. So,
So Leslie, you're saying that, let's use the Palmer development as an example. When that first was brought forward, they had a consultant analyze usage based upon some very broad geographical comparisons. So their number was quite high. But then when they actually looked at the developer and the builder who had built a similar multi-unit complex very close by, their actual use was substantially less because they used such efficient fixtures and appliances, etc. So they were able to take that and say this should really apply to this new development at a lower number than originally proposed, and that's what was accepted. So what you're saying here is that if they had come forward with that larger number and it had been approved, then if they actually used less, that water that had been committed would still be held as committed demand, even though it wasn't being used. Is that correct?
I think that's one of our offshoots that we're trying to work through. For this one, let me just...
Because what you're saying is ADWR would look at that if that extra excess water was reallocated for development, then they would have a problem having that included in the total water portfolio available for the future.
So I hear what you're saying. I think it comes down to we don't have a special box to put that volume in the worm and put it aside. So I think you do want to be cycling water, but at this point there's no mechanism for staff to capture that difference. And I think it would be similar to, and this is why we're trying to sort out, all these questions, is redevelopment of a property. So if the property is redeveloped and it was using, say, an acre foot, and then it's now seeking 5 acre feet, how do we track that so you have reliable, reproducible information out of the worm?
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. It's interesting that you brought up the Palmer apartment complex. It's in the ranch. It's behind the mall, and we discussed this last week at the Water Issues Subcommittee meeting, and Leslie brought it to our attention that the worm has no way to figure out any prior existing recorded water agreements because the apartment complex is on a parcel that originally had an agreement in return for an easement across the Bullwhacker Ranch. It was only supposed to be, 35 units, and we approved several hundred
209,
units.
I think.
Could you explain that, and maybe we should in the future put something in our water policy that we need to do a record search of recorded prior water agreements before we proceed?
So herein lies the details of water management. So you do have some very complex and sometimes old water agreements. And so if your policy isn't driving the folks who operate this policy to look for certain things, so if they're not looking in the worm, they're just using 0.17 and 0.12, then they're not digging into it as far as we did in the past to make sure everything was in order for that development and for bringing the council a complete picture. So you're correct. We did present this as one of the examples that we were using to look at this. So here again, the developer's not bad, the landowner's not bad. It's the responsibility of the city to work out its policies. So this is just an example of, and it's somewhat unique, as you said, because it has an old document about moving water across a ranch to get to another subdivision. So we want to just make sure we have those things in order. And that's really all I have on that one, unless you have some more.
Hello, Council. Brian Reese, Water Resources and Environmental Services Manager. Just to expand upon that, yeah, and that's the communication phase between the Water Resources Management Group and the Community Development Group. For them to let us know what they're looking at approving, and for us to let them know the details of the water, of the complexities of the water documents that are in place. And through this process, that's one of the goals that we've determined, or one of the things that we determined needed to be done, and one of the goals we have through it. So,
Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Thank you, Mayor. Leslie, you know, one of the things that I was reading through this last night, and I noticed there was no reference to swimming pools. Now, we don't have a lot of them up here, but I did see a new development that is going to have I thought it said a 20,000 gallon pool. Do we have some way to calculate that as a one-time allotment? I mean, how do you address a swimming pool?
You know, I've been out of water service agreement allocation process for quite a while, but I do understand that they add on unique features like that, using at one time the DWR calculations for swimming pools or green spaces or landscape. You know, it can kind of just keep going if it's one of those, either a master plan subdivision or even a apartment complex that might have a sizable swimming pool.
Yeah, because even on the landscaping, in what way, at what point do we enforce the landscape choices? Is it upon the final inspection, or does that go through a process? Because, you know, different trees, if it's indigenous, they can use a lot less water than, you know, I don't know, these Siberian elms that Eric Moore brings up a lot. they, if you read about the amount of water they use, theoretically, it's a lot. How do we as a city enforce that list? And I know that list exists in some cases. I just haven't really seen it out there when we're discussing these developments.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. So the initial look at it is when the application, in the mic.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yes, ma'am, the first look at it is going to be when the application is submitted and they provide their plant palette for that development. After that, I'd have to let somebody else speak to other checks that are made along the way. I'm not aware that we have inspectors that go out and verify the landscape choices once they're in. It's on our system.
There was a requirement in Phoenix that the water for a swimming pool had to be hauled in from an outside source. They couldn't run it through the meter. Is that something we should maybe be looking into here?
Yes, ma'am, I'll note it. I'm not sure how the approach might work, but every question or concern we can look into and figure out if there's an appropriate mechanism within the commission as well to look at it.
It might be worth, because if you're talking about the size of some of these pools nowadays, they can take a lot of water.
Right.
Yeah,
and in
you.
some cases, you might want them. You know, you might have an expansion like we're seeing. You know, hospitals need to be upsized. Other things need to be upsized as the community grows. So you might see that, well, maybe we need another YMCA where there's going to be a large pool so that people can recreate and children can learn, you know, different skills, safety skills with water. I'll take it to the last slide here and wrap up. Just like a paragraph or two. So,
Councilmember Rusing, you had a last-minute question here.
I'll wait till she's finished. Thank you.
Okay, so last example, policy 21, wells on any property to be served by the city must be officially abandoned through the ADWR. As part of the approval of a water service application, the increase in groundwater allowance received for these wells shall be retained in the city's water portfolio and not used to support additional development that is not identified as current committed or future demand within the WRM. So the concern that we're aware of from a staff level is that when we were developing the application for our decision and order, we put forward abandoned wells because we can seek a half acre foot increase to our groundwater block. So we already did that, but this policy is speaking kind of counter to putting it aside and not using it for new development. We put it into the application to use it for new development. So once again, it's, whatever you want to call it, disconnects or alignment, we want to make sure things are aligning across the board. The committee, said council seeks from the policy development team what practices were in place or would be in place for a staff to follow this policy. A policy that doesn't have practices in place, then it should not be included in a document to give the impression that certain actions are taking place when they're not. So it's not that we can't in the future, but we need to, once again, it's an alignment thing. We can't be doing one thing in an application that we filed in 2021 and do something different in a 2022 policy. So it's just understanding things across your
Councilman
playing
Shishka.
field.
Thank you, Mayor. Leslie, on this point, on the retirement of wells,
Yes, sir.
you don't actively put what the well had back into, let's say, new development water, but it's my understanding that what you do is take it out of the requirement for the new development. Say if it's a half an acre foot and the new development requires 2 acre feet, that half acre foot comes out of the 2 acre feet, right?
I've seen a mix happen. So I think we have some contracts that read that way. And then we've had others, in the past 5 years that the 2019 policy said you don't put things in contract anymore. So I apologize, Councilman Shishka. I think
That's
there's a
all
little
right.
bit of a mixed bag
Yeah. Okay.
there. But the bottom line where we stand right now is that the half an acre foot has been pledged to support new development. So it's showing up in our application as you have this much demand, and we're trying to build that supply side to make it at least equal or not, exceed,
Sure.
a little bit more.
Okay.
So that was part of the building blocks to bring the supply side up.
Thank you.
Yep. So this concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to return, any feedback that you have. We'll be reviewing the tape carefully for the commission. Thoughts to help the committee focus on which draft policy recommendations should be given priority, and if bridging the city with the 22 policy seems appropriate while the decision and order is under modification, and should, basic work can be done with this policy. It's not bad. I mean, I hope I don't come across it, it's bad. We were asked to carefully look at it and figure out where we needed to address things. I think it can have some changes to it and help bridge the city, but is it also worth putting staff time more towards a framework for a long-term management plan? Not your commission, but putting staff on that task. And I'm happy to take any
Councilmember
further
Rusin.
questions.
Okay, thank you. One of the things that came up last week during the Water Issues Subcommittee meeting was the word existing and what that meant. And it was implied that maybe we needed a better definition or understanding. Could you please talk about that?
That is within one of your recommendations that the commission brought forward. The short story is prior to the 2019 policy change, existing was known across the board as anything that was pre-1998. So that was an existing contract. From 1999 on, when you became a designated water provider, you were putting water into contract alternative supplies. So for water management staff at the time, existing, we were trying to do our best to hold the subdivisions and those communities pre-1998 at their current platting level. But the councils in the past also recognized that we could use some of these alternative water supplies, which the state was requiring because we were an AMA now identified as being out of safe yield. Piece those in. You might have somebody who had a large lot within your service area, 5 acres, and they thought, well, we wanted to split it, or within a subdivision, a large lot subdivision, and they wanted to split it. So we would backfill and protect that water, by doing that. So the question comes down to, it's not defined in policy, but the actions that we're seeing is that even if it was a contract that was prepared in like the last 5 years, that's deemed existing. And we can see some challenges, once again, similar to the other item we brought up, where if you don't look into the history a little bit further, you might find yourself saying, wow, we didn't plan any water supplies for that area because that wasn't the plan. There may be a contract in place, but the contract has to then align with ADWR rules about preliminary and final platting, meeting substantial conformance. And now I'm using all sorts of words. You're like, I don't know what you're talking about, Leslie. But there's rules within ADWR as water resources folks that we have to make sure we understand and convey them clearly to councils and others. So yes, within the commission, there is a recommendation about how do we address existing and making sure it's clear into the future.
Yeah, because that's very important designation, because if it's existing, it can be approved administratively, and even if it's a couple of hundred units, it can still be approved administratively if it's existing, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then I just wanted to thank the commission for all their hard work. We really appreciate it, and they're working hard to strengthen our water policy by closing the loopholes and clarifying gray areas. So I thank you very much, because it helps encourage our conservation program and continue the wise management of this precious resource.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. I will second Councilmember Rusing's comment. I do think that I know this has been a challenge getting all these folks to kind of work together, and everyone started from a different place in terms of knowledge base and kind of everyone tackling the process. And some people wanted to maybe go after broader ideas than merely the water policy itself. So I know there's been challenges associated with that. One of the things that occurs to me that you're kind of driving towards is that we have this water policy in place, and then we have a decision order in place. And one of the things that I think might be useful, while I appreciate the terminology of bridging this policy to what our 2019 policy was, and kind of making sense of the disconnect there between that and the 2019 policy, I think we have a larger challenge that we have to kind of look at, which is the idea of an overarching kind of water management policy that goes beyond even our water policy, that gets us through decision order and decision in order. And I would be interested in seeing if, because there is interest on this commission to address the bigger issues of our water supply and our water issues, maybe they might have some insight and suggestion that they might be able to provide staff, or maybe they can participate in that. I don't know the nature of the mandate they have from the mayor as an ad hoc committee, if there's some realignment that needs to be done. But I think you've got some really bright people there that have some long-term strategic vision and want to share that with the community and with council. And so I, for one, would like to see kind of that incorporated in, as well as the ongoing mission, which I think is really vital, to continually review this policy, get feedback in real time from people who are a part of the community in a variety of manners of life, to say, hey, this is working, this isn't working, this is really good, or did you ever consider this? Those are good, and this is a really comprehensive thing. I imagine the next time they bring recommendations, it won't be as exhaustive, because hopefully we'll have dealt with a lot of things. So it might be useful to, at the very least, for staff to start developing a long-term strategic plan around water beyond just the water policy we have and the decision order we have, because I think that would kind of knit together both of those things. So that's just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Leslie, I just have a question from slide number 4, which we went through earlier, but I wanted to know if there's a plan in place or what your thinking is. In that paragraph, it says, it is evident the city is lacking a long-range water management plan to carry the city's water health and safety when there are changes from one elected and leadership bodies to another, which we've seen. We've seen that recently in the last few years. And so is there a plan in place? And if there is a plan, what is that plan to develop a long-range city water management plan, and how would that come about?
So I think that follows Mayor Pro Tem Montoya's
does. Yeah, it
point
builds on what
very,
he was just asking.
very well. So, and I wanted to clarify, maybe I misspoke or maybe I wasn't clear, is that we are looking at the 22 policy and getting the best we can to bridge and get us to a long-term management plan. So then looking at long-term management plan, I can't think of a community or a group in the state that doesn't have longer range planning. So the steps, we talked about this a little bit at the Water Issues Committee, in that within the general plan of 2015, there was discussions that the city needed a long-term management plan. And the first step was the water resource management model, because it was going to be your data repository to move yourself and be able to have a long-term management plan. But it was also to make sure you had your data in order so you could update your decision order, because we knew that was coming as well. So the work that has been fairly brief, fairly small, because it's not the task of the commission. We did make a comparison because the question was, is the 22 policy effective? And so we compared it against 19, and we compared it to a long-term management plan. And so what you're looking at that is we can look at what they looked at as a reference, and they could have used anything, was Tucson Water. And so Tucson Water has a 50-year plan, and then it's not a stagnant plan. It's supposed to be, looking at it every 5 years. So to your question, framework, we got to know the framework. We need to know, how we're going to populate that framework. Pros and cons, we have to be making sure we're talking with other departments as a water resource manager I've done in the past, making sure that we're hearing from what Parks and Recs needs, what fire department needs, all these things, economic development needs, to make sure that we have those supplies available.
I guess I just want to make the comment that when the political winds change, like they do from time to time, that the policy is in place, and I think
Carries.
It's the policy isn't being created necessarily by elected officials, but by staff who are water experts, and not by people who are not necessarily water experts.
And maybe just one more piece to tag in, because I think it's important as well, is that you have a general plan update happening as well.
Right.
And working with community development, Ms. DeWitt and others, we were very excited to hear that now there's an implementation. So it's not just build your general plan and say, well, we did it, everybody's good, but now implementation. And I think that's probably what kind of fell to the side a little bit last time, was it
Wasn't
city
actionable.
Yeah, the city knew a long-term management plan. I took them through their first step of the data repository known as a long-term management model, which we've recoined the name to a water resource, whatever, worm. and so it goes. So I think that you're going to see some great coordination coming out of the general plan as well. We just have to make all these things, I call them gears that have to mesh and turn. And if we have something out, it's not going to turn right.
Thank you.
Well, I do want to make the point that when I ran for mayor 2 years ago, it was very clear to me, since I was on the city council when the water policy was dramatically altered in 2019, that that policy was generating a escalating amount of growth that was outstripping our ability to provide equivalent public safety services, extend appropriate utilities into those growth areas, and even deciding to deliver water outside city limits, that had, in my opinion, quite a detrimental expectation of our ability to manage our water supplies in the future. So with that as a primary focus on my concerns, and I think the public at large agreed with my concerns there, implementing a new water management plan that was more deliberate, was more analytical, and had more data to justify usage of our portfolio so that we could grow at a measured pace and be able to still provide the public safety services and utility extensions that we could afford to do, and also be able to assure those new residents that they were going to have as equivalent amount of safety as any other resident in the city. So with that said, drafting in essence, an interim policy so that we could get going with that, with the understanding that this wasn't going to be the be-all and end-all. In my professional career, it's pretty clear that if you spend too much time analyzing things, you never get any results generated. And guess what? The world changes in the process, and it's the old term analysis paralysis. So we put together a reasonably good initial policy, implemented that, and then created this advisory commission to look at what that policy was doing, how better it could be done, and then revising it over time so that it continued to improve. Then, once we have a workable policy in effect, then we can start looking at devising a long-term management plan that could proceed beyond changes of elected officials on the city council, and then also being able to align it at the same time while we're working on redoing our general plan. So those two should be relatively well aligned, and that takes us out to maybe a 10-year time frame. And once we achieve that phase, then perhaps we can adopt something like the Tucson plan for a very long-term plan of managing our water in connection with our decision and order and the concerns about the Arizona Department of Water Resources, to be able to make sure that we can demonstrate to them that our policy is effective and give them assurance that they can continue to maintain our status as a assured water supplier. So obviously we've got decision and order, we've got 80 WR involved, we've got the general plan, and then we have to have a workable policy in the city so that we can manage our public safety resources and other necessary services and supplies to current and new developments. So with that said, Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I would support a long-range water management plan for our community. Thank you.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Thank you, Mayor. As I read through these 21 different policy descriptions, the one thing that came to my mind was this is very common sense driven, and something Eric Moore just said, Councilman Moore. You want to know how we survive the political winds, and we are attempting to do that in every department at this city right now. We're pivoting into a data-driven city, as we have needed to be for quite some time. And if this water policy is crafted under these common sense policies, but backed up by real data, it will survive the political winds, because the numbers don't lie. And once we have that there, and I think we should look at it more often than 5 years. Maybe we do it every 2 years. Things do change in the construction industry, for example. We have these low water use things that were not around in 1950, 1960, even up into 1980. That was a big drastic change for all of us. And I look for things to change in terms of landscaping, another big draw on our water. Those policies are going to be set in stone at some point, and we're going to have to enforce those things at some point, because that's going to make a big difference of the water usage. But again, common sense, I think it's great. We're going to survive the political winds based on data. As the city, just like our mayor says, we pivot into that. So thank you for doing the work.
Do we have any public comment at this point?
We do, Mayor. Tony Hamer.
Mr. Mayor, Council, thank you very much for hearing me. Leslie, you survived the Inquisition. Well done. This is the #1 issue for citizens out there. You go and talk to thousands of people, as I have in the last couple of months here. This is their #1 issue, is water. Why is that? Mainly because there's a lot of misinformation and poor information around water and what our status is. I have in the last couple of weeks taken the opportunity to become more educated in that respect and have been out to the departments, spent time with Leslie and her department, and there is good information out there. So one thing that I would like the council to consider is putting out some good integrated communications to the community, because otherwise we're going to suffer with misinformation from the internet, from various bodies, and the job of managing the city becomes very difficult. I really appreciated the education Leslie gave me, and I've been very impressed by the skills and capabilities of people within the departments as well. Further today, I learnt about worms, so that was good to hear something of fundamental Earth-like substance. So worms is one of my new vocabulary items. The biggest thing that I think was brought forward today is it's recommended the city begin the process to develop a long-term water management plan. That is very clearly something which is missing at this point. So what do? We drive down the road and we hit various pebbles and we're disturbed by that and we sit and talk about the pebbles. That's not what we should be talking about. A long-term plan will give us the vision on where the road is going, and we can in that way do a lot better job in terms of management. So the mayor actually just started right now with a design basis memorandum for the long-range plan. I hope the council will take him up on that and prioritize this plan. It's the number one thing that citizens want. It's the number one thing which will simplify a lot of the decisions and quasi-decisions that we need to make. So prioritize. Where would it come in terms of an ordered list of major items for the citizens? I would suggest it should be close to the top, as it's top for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamer.
That's all, Mayor.
All right, without any further comment or concerns or questions from the council, this study session is adjourned.